So for drainage water management in the Great Plains, I'm going to cover kind of three main themes during this talk. And the first one is we get a lot less rain than most of the Corn Belt, but we still can deal with a lot of water. And I'm also going to talk about how drainage can help us manage water during these critical times of the year and improve a field's consistency from year to year. And then finally, I'm going to end with talking about a few of the conservation drainage solutions that can give us some practical solutions that you can tailor to the individual needs of your farm. So this is just a big map of ecoregions of North America. And I like to look at this because this kind of helps to show a little bit of the similarities and the differences that we might have between our regions. If we kind of zoom in a little bit here to the Northern Great Plains region, the best I could figure is on this map, you guys are located about there. Please give me a few inches or centimeters either way. I'm located down here. So we're just on the edge of that 5.0. We're all in the Northern Great Plains. But where I originally came from is down here in this green area. So dealing with quite some different environments in Ohio as opposed to kind of what you and I are dealing with today in the Northern Great Plains. So back in the part of Ohio I came from was part of the Great Black Swamp. And this area was kind of known when it was first settled as, for its swampland and horrible malaria epidemics. And so drainage moved into this region of Ohio really early on, and Ohio is really proud of its history. Drainage in the Swamplands Acts, which came through the United States in the mid 1800s, and really that's what helped develop a lot of the Eastern Corn Belt for agriculture. So one of the really big differences between Ohio and the Great Plains region is that in Ohio and in most of the Eastern Corn Belt, drainage has been there already for 150 plus years. It's something that people just kind of accept as the way it is, and it's how we farm in the Eastern Corn Belt. And so a lot of the work that I did before was characterizing the losses that we see out of the various pathways, looking at how much water was coming out of tile drainage systems versus how much was running over the surface and overland runoff. And what we found in Ohio was that really there are kind of two main principles for the difference between these two pathways. Surface runoff is really fast and intense. You get a big, fast rainfall event. It overwhelms the capacity of the soil to absorb it, and it runs off. Whereas tile drainage is, slow and steady. You are maybe losing just a little bit of water every day, and because it doesn't really get cold in Ohio, that is happening almost every day of the year. The drains don't ever stop flowing through the winter. So that informs a little bit of kind of some of the strategies that come out of the Eastern Corn Belt, is this idea of kind of slow and steady versus fast and intense. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these differences between Ohio and the Northern Great Plains as we kind of move through the presentation. The other kind of fun fact about, where I'm at in Minnesota is, and especially I think this is happening in your neck of the woods too, is we're really seeing a lot of expansion of tile drainage into these new areas. So this map, I know the text is going to be really hard to see at the bottom of the screen, so I'll just kind of walk you through it, where there's a bright red spot over that Northwest Ohio area that I've already highlighted. That was in 1992, according to the Census of Agriculture, the most intensively drained region of the entire United States. And what we have seen, if we sort of zoom into Minnesota as an example, back in 1992, really only southern Minnesota had drainage, and there's really pretty sparse kind of in the as you move out and further north. The next time they asked this question on the United States Department of Agriculture census that they do once every 5 years was in 2012. So we have kind of a 20-year span where we can see that red spot moving, from away from Northwest Ohio. It's kind of radiating outward. And in Minnesota, we're seeing more and more tile drainage systems as people are looking to manage water. And then again, they asked this question in 2017, and you see the same thing. It's kind of a slow but steady advancing of drainage into areas that historically have not been had drainage as part of their, farming systems. But one thing that we know is that not everything from the Corn Belt translates exactly to the Northern Great Plains. I'll also take a minute to introduce, this is my dog, and I call her Bert, and Bert is, she accompanies me on a lot of my journeys, so she's going to make some appearances throughout. But not everything that translates in the Eastern Corn Belt really works in the Northern Great Plains. Really, specifically, we have a lot more diverse crop rotations and variable soils. And I know that even the crops that you grow in Saskatchewan are even just a little bit different from what we grow in Northwest Minnesota, but there's a lot more choices that we have. Spring wheat is huge where I'm at, but it's not all just corn and soybeans. So you have these different crops and you have different soils. Sometimes it's sandy, sometimes it's clay, and there's really a lot of variability out there. The other challenge, which today is a great example of in Northwest Minnesota, is it's cold. It's cold and it's snowy. And so this picture was not from today, it's from a few years ago, but, just kind of a sense of, just how cold it can get. But then not only is it cold and snowy, is that we get all of that water at one time. It floods. In the spring, we're dealing with an extent of flooding that, just before I moved up to this region was really not something I could really visualize. So, this picture is the Red River at Grand Forks. So, all this water coming north into Canada and into Lake Winnipeg eventually, but, this is just a massive amount of water in Grand Forks that, is moving up from the landscape northward. This image was, this was actually taken by one of my undergraduate student assistants. And this is from the balcony of his apartment. And this also shows, this is farmland that is just completely underwater this past spring. And we really had kind of an exceptional amount of water to deal with this spring. And some of that is because the soils are still frozen at this time of the year. So there isn't a lot of absorption of water into the soil profile and down to the water table. So this is in Crookston, where just down the street from my house, we have a lot of levees to handle this water, in the waterways. But moving this water out is a big challenge. And it comes with this surface runoff and surface erosion, what I mentioned before, these fast and intense events. And we really see quite a lot of soil moving with this surface runoff. So we're dealing with this. This is what our fields look like in the spring. And then we move into the summer and things get hot. It gets hot and it gets dry. Being towards the middle of the continent, particularly, we don't have any oceans to sort of help make that summer a little bit more mild. So we see a lot of soil cracking too once we get to this part of the year. So these are all things that are really different from what I had seen previously working in kind of a more southern and more temperate climate. So what does this mean for runoff and tile drainage? This is one of the big questions that I had when I came up to Minnesota. And so I started to dig into what we'd actually done so far. This is something, it takes a while to ramp up some tile drainage collection. So I looked and found over the past 20 years, the most I could find about tile drainage in Minnesota, and thinking about these different regions, and also thinking about our Northwest region. If you think back to that map I showed, Northwest is going to be most similar to what we see in Saskatchewan and the rest of the Great Plains. And we had, about 100 years plus of site years to base our analysis off of. So looking at kind of the differences, what we really see is Northwest Minnesota is different than the other regions, and we get less precipitation. These are in millimeters per year. And what's important to see is these over the past 20 years, you can see a wide range of precipitations that we see. But on average, Northwest Minnesota gets less rain than the other regions. And that translates to how much of our rainfall actually gets moved into that tile drainage pathway. How much of it is becoming tile drainage discharge. And we actually get less rainfall turning into tile discharge in Northwest Minnesota as well. And we kind of see as central Minnesota and Northwest, kind of as you move away from kind of the southwest part of the state and into Northwest, you're getting less of that rainfall and precipitation coming as tile discharge. And I think that's really because a lot of our precipitation does fall as snow. And as I mentioned before, our ground is frozen for part of the year. So tile drainage in winter is really not moving a lot of water. And the amount of precipitation that comes as runoff, when we looked across the state as a whole, we see again that fast and intense pulse of water is really difficult to predict, and it's really variable. So we saw no trends at all in looking at our subsurface or our surface losses. So kind of our big summary of what we found in this study is, Northwest Minnesota and that northern Great Plains region, as you sort of are moving away from the eastern Corn Belt area, you're really seeing less precipitation and, as a consequence, less tile discharge. But our surface runoff is still highly variable. When this comes to moving soils, and this is a total phosphorus load, on the left-hand side of the screen, we see fields that do not have any tile drainage, and on the right-hand side, we see fields that are tile drained. This really translates to our phosphorus losses tend to be more predictable and less variable in our tile drained fields. And some of that kind of speaks to the capacity of tile drainage systems to actually absorb more water when you have those fast and intense rainfall events. It changes the pathways, gives a little bit extra capacity of the soil to be able to absorb that water and those intense rains. And so we do see that play out in the total phosphorus load. The other thing to kind of note is that, again, Northwest Minnesota, Northern Great Plains has the least amount of phosphorus losses out of our tile drainage system compared to the other regions. So again, less rain, less water movement, but also less environmental impact if you're thinking about freshwater systems and soil erosion. So that is, I think, all a really positive thing for the Northern Great Plains region. We don't have quite that concern that we might see in other places where, well, do you install drains and how does that affect downstream systems? It's just less of a concern. One of the things that I did want to mention, especially as we're talking about environmental impact, this black line that goes across, that's in the Eastern Corn Belt. That's kind of our target level of phosphorus losses that we have for Western Lake Erie Basin. If every acre were to lose the same amount of phosphorus in Western Lake Erie Basin, then that's the level that would sort of translate to algal blooms in Lake Erie, which of course is something that is a really high priority issue in Ohio. And I think it's an issue in, it's growing to be more of an issue in Lake Winnipeg as well, which has kind of been, something I'm keeping phosphorus losses kind of in the top of my mind based on my experiences from Western Lake Erie Basin, where that did interfere with people's drinking water source. So kind of keeping that in mind when we think about tile drainage versus surface runoff is what's moving those big pulses of soil. So when we're thinking about splitting that up into different categories, the blue categories are surface runoff and the green categories are tile drainage. And the colors just mean whether that's kind of bound to particulates. If it's lighter, it's not bound to particulates, and the darker bars are bound to sediment. And then again, what we're seeing is kind of more of the same, like our tile drainage is helping reduce the amount of phosphorus that we see moving in surface runoff. And that can be really devastating, on farms. So in some ways, and I do always hesitate to say this somewhat, sometimes people don't like when I say this, but tile drainage can be a phosphorus management practice because it helps to reduce that surface runoff and those surface runoff effects. And we do see that really consistently throughout the state of Minnesota, as well as back in Ohio. Of course, you do have a potential trade-off with nitrogen, but as many of you know, especially where freshwater sources are so important, the phosphorus can be a higher target than nitrogen losses. So it just sort of depends on what watershed you're in. And again, that kind of line at the top showing kind of where that goal phosphorus levels, and what we're seeing, especially in Northwest Minnesota, way below any sort of environmental impact levels from the tile drainage system. So that's really good. I think it's a really positive thing that we're seeing out of our data. Just to kind of summarize this part of the study, for our phosphorus loads, our tile drainage actually had less phosphorus loading than our untiled sites. Northwest Minnesota was less than the other three regions, so we don't have to be quite as concerned. But our dissolved phosphorus was about the same. So whether it's attached to soil particles and eroding versus kind of just coming through the tile lines naturally, it was about even. So Northwest Minnesota, and I would say the Great Plains, obviously the best and has no phosphorus problems. That's what we're learning. Well, not necessarily. I mean, we still have to be concerned about these erosion processes, especially in times when we're dealing with snow melt, because this is when we don't have the benefit of tile drainage to help us minimize these surface runoff events. So it's a little bit of a timing difference. You can still have things like cover crops or other land stabilizing best management practices to help keep the soil on the landscape. And, again, corgi for scale on the map there, we can really still move a lot of soil. And I think also, I thought this was kind of interesting because this shows both of our regions as well. When you're looking across, this is modeled data, really Minnesota leading into Lake Winnipeg has a lot more erosion potential than where you all are at in Saskatchewan. So, and I think a lot of this is because of kind of our particular landscape and soils, especially since this is modeled outputs. But I think this is where it's always good to keep in mind, well, we don't necessarily have no phosphorus problems. We just have different phosphorus problems. And, but I also think that this shows, tile drainage doesn't necessarily contribute to this particular issue. So again, just to kind of recap, that we have this kind of fast and intense events, especially in Northwest Minnesota, can still be a problem in the colder months when our tile drainage isn't working. But it can help us kind of slow that flow down and release it over time. One of the things that we noticed when we were looking at this data is especially that Northwest Minnesota, we just didn't have as many sites and as much data because there are fewer people working in this space. So one of the things I did was I designed the coolest drainage plots in Minnesota. And I can claim that because we are the furthest north and the coolest, by annual average temperature in the state of Minnesota. So we actually have been monitoring some of these pathways in a tile drained field since these were installed in October of 2019. And the idea behind these plots was really to look at the farm scale. We drained 60 acres, divided that up into 4 different plots. Actually, we technically drained only 30 acres. I should say we have a study site of 60 acres. Our soils are a silty clay loam. They're about 1 meter deep or 3 feet and 15 meters apart. They're about 50 feet spacing. And we divided that 60-acre field up into 4 15-acre chunks. And we're looking at the differences. What happens on a big scale when you have 15 acres drained next to 15 acres that are undrained? This is all one field. And we're farming it all the same too. This is one of the farms that this is owned by the Northwest Research and Outreach Center where I work. So I actually get to interact with the guys that are farming it every year. And, they can give me feedback on how this is working for them. So as I mentioned before, this was installed in fall of 2019. This was a really wet fall. And actually it was so wet. I think this picture is really interesting. It was so wet that we actually had trouble getting the tile drainage installed. You could see the rolls of tile out there. The spring wheat came off already, but we were just waiting for it to be dry enough to actually do the installation. So I was like, okay, this is great. This shows we really do need the tile drainage out on this field. And even when we did install the drains, the soils were so saturated. In this picture, it's a little hard to see, but there's actually a tractor pulling the drain plow through the plots to help us install our drainage. So this is, so again, it's really, we really mudded up the place in 2019. And then in 2020, we started our data collection. This is the field. The part of the design is that we have 2 lift stations. We didn't have a deep enough ditch to use a gravity outlet for draining the field. So we actually have 2 separate lift stations. The one that's pumping, that's closer to the screen, that collects the water from that 30 acres that are drained. The other one collects only the surface runoff. It's a little bit hard to see, but there are some drop surface inlets that run across the edge of the field. And all of those come, they cut across the field. We collect all the surface water, or as much of it as we can, and that gets pumped out. So we have 2 separate streams of water to be able to be looking at those same types of interactions that I was just talking about, what's coming from surface, what's coming from tile, and, how is all of those in-field nutrient cyclings interacting. And we've been also doing a lot of really intensive soil sampling on this field too. That's one of the fun things. So in the coming years, we don't have a lot of this fully finalized just yet, but we have had some graduate students looking at things like the nitrogen cycling and the carbon cycling that's happening after the drainage installation, really with the goal eventually of trying to say, well, do we need revised fertility recommendations on these newly drained fields? You're totally changing the hydrology, but really with kind of some of the weather that we've had the last 2 years, we had a really wet year in 2020, followed by 2 dry years in 2021 and 2022. So we haven't quite come to the end or the conclusion of that analysis just yet, but soon we will be kind of looking at those sort of impacts. But what we do have is really, we were looking at, the difference in these drained and undrained plots between 2020, which was really wet, and 2021, which was, the worst drought that we'd had in a long time in Northwest Minnesota. So this is looking at precipitation and the differences in precipitation between those 2 years. The blue bars are in 2020, and actually this is starting not by the calendar year, it's actually starting in September, and especially with the cropping systems that we have in Northwest Minnesota. I personally observed we start banking water for the next growing season in about September, and then that carries us through till the next maybe August. And what we see is just night and day differences in the amount of rain that we got between 2020, where we got 7 inches of rain. Again, that's where we were trying to install. It's actually the fall of 2019. Sorry, I misspoke there, but this is when we were trying to install this drainage. We had 7 inches of rain, followed by 4 inches of rain, which was just a historic high level of rainfall for the fall. Then we moved into kind of the winter and got a lot of snow. And then in June and July also got hit again with a lot of rainfall. Then it's almost like somebody turned off the rain entirely, just shut it off like a light switch. The next year, starting in fall of 2020 and moving into the summer of 2021, we got almost no rain at all. We didn't get a full inch of rain until maybe May or June of the next year. So really dealing with pretty severe drought conditions in 2021 on this newly drained field project. And then the black bar with the dashed line, those are showing the historic average. So, way over average in 2020, way below average in 2021. So the next picture I have here is a look at from the yield monitor itself, then kind of overlaid the different drainage treatments on top of it. So what we see in 2019, that's before it was drained, we see pretty consistent yields kind of throughout. The spring wheat, again, growing, and yeah, some differences. Obviously, it's pretty normal variability, I would say, for a field. But then we get to see 2020, where we had soybeans, and if you can kind of look, and it again might be a little bit hard to see on the screen, but we had really patchy development of soybeans. One thing about soybeans is they really don't like having wet feet. So especially being planted into really wet ground and then being inundated with water really hurt the yields. And the yield monitor for 2020, one of the things that really stands out are there's some red streaks that go from east to west across that field. Those are all of our surface ditches. So we plant right through those surface ditches. They're kind of more like furrows than actual like surface drains because we farm right through them. But, those were so inundated with water, especially early, that we had really poor yields in those lower lying spots. And then we moved to 2021. And what we saw again is the exact opposite. We had, really dry. We're back to spring wheat. So you could almost compare the picture on the top to the picture on the bottom to look at the different yields. In 2019, our highest yielding areas were like 83 bushels per acre, which was really pretty good, even for this area. But then in 2021, we had between 0 and 70 bushels per acre. Bushels per acre is the maximum. So really a big impact of drought. Something to kind of look at here, and you can sort of visually see it here, but it's a little bit easier to see on the next slide, is that we have higher yields in our drained spaces in 2020, but then maybe slightly lower yields in our drained spaces in 2021. But from year to year, what we saw is lower yield variability between the two drained systems. In 2019, obviously really good yields happening. These are all translated to kilograms per acre. but this is if my graduate student put this together, and so they put it into the SI units instead of bushels per acre, but you could sort of keep those numbers from the previous slide in your head. Yeah, our average yield was closer, was higher in 2019 before we had any drainage installation. Then we see 2020 where we're hit with way more water than we're used to, and our yields were, poorer. There's a wider distribution of yields in the blue, the undrained portion of the field, than in the kind of yellow, the drained portion of the field. And then in 2021, you see the undrained yields actually being a little bit higher than the drained portion of the field. So this was kind of the opposite of what I expected, but there's still, those peaks are really still pretty close together, but there's less spread, there's less variability in our drained in those yellow portions. And that's really important because what we're seeing is more consistent yields. Even if it's lower, it's more consistent from part to part in the field. And this actually lines up pretty well with what I have been hearing from reports of the guy that actually runs the farm equipment out on this field. Is he was telling me that before the drainage was installed, they would maybe have to, plant that whole 60-acre block in 2 chunks, do part of it one day and then come back and finish it. And he said, since it's been installed, they've been able to treat all of that as one unit and not have to worry about those wet spots as much. So again, making that field more consistent, the yields more consistent throughout. And overall, that's a benefit because it's making the conditions more predictable. So then if we're looking at soil moisture again, and this kind of helps to explain a little bit maybe why we saw reduced yields in our drained sections of the field. And some of that is because of the soil moisture. One of the things that's really interesting about this graph, and again, I apologize if it's a bit small for you all to see, but where we turned the lift stations on in June, you can actually see that the drained portion and the undrained portion split apart. So again, the green at the top line is the undrained portion of the field, but the drained portion is lower. So we're seeing that tile drainage work right away. In the first couple of days after we turn the lift stations on, we're starting to see a positive benefit. Now, one thing that I will point out is that we get to, if you remember back to where I was showing those graphs of precipitation, once we got to September and October of this year, that's when we stopped seeing any rainfall at all. And the unfortunate part of this is because we'd had more drainage out of from our lift station, we started to see that separation in soil moisture that carried through till the next growing season. So the early part of May and June of 2021, you can see they kind of start off with the drained portions having a bit of a disadvantage in terms of soil moisture. It's a slight disadvantage, but it still is a disadvantage. And since we just got no rain at all, pretty quickly we bottomed out in soil moisture in both plots. But just to have something in the soil to to keep the plants, get the plants started, we just didn't even have. So that's something that was maybe a downside of drainage. But there are ways that we could have managed this differently if that had been the research experiment. So I'll kind of talk about that a little bit next. Because one thing that we know is that one size does not fit all. This again is my corgi. She's trying to wear regular dog boots for the snow, but her short little stubby legs did not fit properly into the boots, is what I'm showing. So just her face is, she's mad because we know one size does not fit all. One growing season, things are going to look totally different from the next growing season. And that's something that we really, we know from our experiences farming and looking at these things from time after time. So one of the ways we can help to kind of combat this, you know, this way of managing different growing seasons is with conservation drainage. And I have to make a quick plug for Conservation Drainage Network, which you can find at conservationdrainage.net, and I can send the information to Canvas to share with all of you later. But this is a network that we are looking at these kind of different strategies that can work and trying to look across systems. So not just me looking at my local area in Northwest Minnesota and saying what works here, but trying to find those kind of universal things that work everywhere. And the principle behind conservation drainage is really maximizing the benefits of drainage while minimizing our on-farm and downstream impacts. So kind of like meeting all of the goals. Some of the ways we can manage tile drainage water are with controlled drainage, denitrifying bioreactors, phosphorus removal structures, saturated buffers, and with drainage water recycling. Because of time, I'm only going to talk about the first three in a little bit more detail, but just to kind of give you a sense of what these all are. Controlled drainage is where you can kind of turn on and off your tile drainage system at different times of the year using gates or boards, or even if you have a lift station, physically switching them on and off. Denitrifying bioreactors are something you can put at the outlet of a drainage system to help reduce nitrate concentrations if that's a concern in your watershed. Phosphorus removal structures are kind of the equivalent practice, but for phosphorus. And then finally, saturated buffers are where instead of coming out directly into a ditch, a tile drainage system can outlet into a distribution pipe underground, and then you use leaching of the water to kind of reduce the amount that goes right out into a ditch. There are, of course, bypasses, so you don't flood out your system upstream, but that can just help to reduce any downstream environmental impacts. And then finally, drainage water recycling, that can fit a lot of different forms. Whether that be you have a pond that maybe you collect drainage water out of and then you irrigate back from. I suspect with the prairie pothole region where you all are, that might be something that if anybody irrigates out of a pothole, would be the sort of thing that would count as drainage water recycling. But drainage water recycling also can be things like sub-irrigation, where you're pumping water backwards into your subsurface drainage lines and being able to use that water. So saturated buffers and drainage water recycling, I won't talk any more about in this presentation, but you can definitely find information on those at the website and ask any questions about them afterwards too. So for controlled drainage, this is what I actually spent a lot of my PhD studying. So I basically have a PhD in controlled drainage. And again, that's, from working with Larry Brown and Norm Fauzi, who were my two co-advisors. And the idea behind controlled drainage is when you need drainage, you need drainage. And the times of year when drainage is really critical is when you have to drive heavy farm equipment through the field, kind of like I showed in the picture, we were trying to drive, drainage plows through the field. We really could have already used drainage in that scenario. And then when the crops are developing, if they don't like wet feet, having something there to help reduce the drainage is helping there to reduce that water table is really important. So there are different times of the year when you need different levels of drainage. And so these boxes, these control structures, you can use to almost act as a dam at the outlet of the drainage pipe. It doesn't fully shut it off, but it just kind of stacks on top of it. And you can hold back water during times of the year when you need it. So the traditional calendar is in the non-growing season. If there's no crop out there at all, you don't need any drainage because nothing's happening. You're not going out there. You're not growing any plants, you can just basically effectively turn off your tile drainage system. Then you would lower it to the deepest level for planting. Then during the growing season, if you want to manage it more, you could stack some boards back in and then hold back a little bit of water for the crop to use. Of course, that does depend on getting the rainfall to actually be able to hold back. So it doesn't create water, but it holds back. If you have that water and you get a rainfall around the kind of 4th of July or August timeframe, that's when the crop can really use it. So preventing that from draining out can sometimes be important. And then finally at harvest, if you have a wet fall, being able to fully drain the field again for timely harvest is really important. So in the context of my farm, if I were doing an experiment on controlled drainage, and I've talked about this with the guys that farm my fields as well, probably I would have actually managed my system differently had this been a controlled drainage experiment. And of course, this is just a straight drainage experiment, so we didn't do any management of our drainage outlets. But as I mentioned before, the soil moisture figure, we turned our lift stations on in July, and we got a lot of rain. But then if you remember, by about August or September, we started to get dry. What I would have done differently if I were doing controlled drainage, I actually would have turned the lift stations off once we got to August, September. At that point, our soybean crop was pretty much grown, it was dry, and then we actually could have conserved water through the drainage system. It would have prevented that difference from coming back from the drained section, and then we could have started with equal water in both sections of the field in 2021. So the next practice I'm going to talk about are wood chip bioreactors. These again are when, for situations when just straight discharge reduction, if you have sort of an environmental impact that you need to address on your farm, wood chip bioreactors are a good solution to that because they work by adding a carbon source to the nitrogen in the drainage water. What happens is this actually pairs with controlled drainage really nicely. You have a control structure, you have water that comes in, it fills up the control structure, and of course it has a bypass. It fills up the wood chips inside underground. Then you have nitrate concentrations in the drainage water. So you have excess nitrogen that maybe is fertilizer that you lost or just natural mineralization happening from the soil profile. The microbes inside of it, they will use the wood chips as a carbon source in conjunction with the nitrogen from the drainage water to use metabolism and metabolize that. So then you're releasing that nitrogen into a nitrogen gas form. This is not harmful in a greenhouse gas sense. And so you're releasing that nitrogen in an environmentally neutral way instead of having it outflow through your outlet. So if you're in an area that maybe has a groundwater nitrate problem or some other nitrate issue in the drinking water, a wood chip bioreactor is a really good solution. The other thing about wood chip bioreactors is that they're really low profile, or they can be. So this is a picture of a wood chip bioreactor, and you may be looking at this and trying to find it, and you can't because it's totally buried underground. In this case, it is fully underground, fully buried, so you wouldn't even know that it's there. These wood chip bioreactors, they can last about 8 to 10 years. So eventually you would need to dig it up, and once the carbon and the wood chips is used up, dig it out and replace it. But these are, like I said, it's a good solution. It's kind of a not short-term or long-term, it's kind of a middle-term solution to nitrate issues in the drainage discharge water. And that's why these are really popular in places like Iowa, where obviously, the Des Moines Waterworks having big nitrate issues. So that's sort of where this technology kind of emerges from. And we're still working on kind of perfecting these technologies in colder climates. but actually we are looking at installing one in Northwest Minnesota, hopefully next summer, because again, it's about the timing of when those microbes are going to be active. You know, if we need that nitrate reduction during the growing season, it does warm up here and get warm enough for the microbes to be able to fix nitrogen and to take up that nitrogen. So we're going to be testing one out in Northwest Minnesota. I also do happen to know there is a wood chip bioreactor in Manitoba from the Manitoba Agriculture, or I think there's one in Manitoba too. So there's some that are happening further north. The last practice I'm going to talk about today are phosphorus removal structures. And like I mentioned, these are sort of the equivalent practice for phosphorus than they are for nitrogen, than wood chip bioreactors are for nitrogen. These basically are ditches, or again, buried underground, that they're containing a material that looks kind of like gravel, but actually is called steel slag. And this is a byproduct well, it can be a byproduct from a lot of things, really from steel production. This is used to scrub out different materials and is a byproduct left. So even though it's called steel slag, it actually doesn't contain any steel. This particular material contains a lot of calcium. So there are 3 materials that bind really well to phosphorus. And if you have high pH soils, you may be familiar with the fact that calcium binds really well to phosphorus. And that's why high pH soils actually have some trouble with phosphorus release, is because it binds really tightly. But this actually can work to your advantage if you happen to have high phosphorus concentrations coming out of tile drainage water, because you can bind to it. The other 2, actually iron will also bind really tightly. So iron shavings are something that have been looked at in phosphorus removal structures, and aluminum is the 3rd. So those 3 tend to be the 3 materials that can be present in phosphorus removal structures. So while denitrifying bioreactors are more of a microbial process, and a lot of nitrogen is microbially driven, phosphorus is very much a chemical process. The release and the binding is all tied up to the chemistry that's happening. So, and then this particular structure was a ditch, and what we found with these results are that, again, this helped to make our phosphorus concentrations coming out of the drainage water just a little bit more consistent over time. You can see that the inflow concentrations, those are in orange. And so those are the lines at the top. They are bouncing around all over the place. Our inflow is really inconsistent, but our outflow, what we were measuring at the outflow, really just helped bring that down and stabilize it over time. Again, this is about kind of stabilizing and making your system more predictable, and then it's easier to manage. So with that, I'll just kind of wrap up again, the kind of these things I talked about, just to remind you all, the drainage water management in the Northern Great Plains. Like I said, we get less water than most of the Corn Belt, but we can still deal with a lot of water, and drainage can help us manage that and improve the field's consistency from year to year. And finally, conservation drainage gives us many practical solutions that can be tailored to the individual needs and concerns of your farm. So with that, I do have, since there was a ton of information in this, a lot of acknowledgements. Wouldn't be able to do this without my great team and all of the organizations that helped out in the different aspects of this experiment. But thank you all very much, and I would be happy, I think we have a little bit of time left for questions, so I'd be happy to answer a few as we have time.
Thanks for a great presentation. Anybody have a question?
A lot of information.
A lot of information there. It's interesting to, it's Miles here, I'm the president, but what I found interesting there is when you talk about the history of the drainage, it's, you know, you've been talking about 150 years ago, so it could be a good resource for us, because I know we're over 100 years behind you in a lot of areas, so. Any questions? Okay, we got Cam Weaver.
Maybe it was mentioned and I just missed it, but as far as that capture method.
So a lot of the work, and yeah, I think it depends a little bit on the concentrations that you're seeing and what material. I did not actually say what the volume was or the loading rate, but it does tend to be a bigger installation that you need. And it depends somewhat on the capacity of your drainage system and how much water is flowing through it, and then what your goals are to for a load reduction. You know, I actually have, you know, especially for the design that I'm trying to do for the wood chips for Northwest Minnesota, one of the challenges we actually have come up with is that we have a really sandy soil. So the drainage coefficient is really high. And so the theoretical like maximum water that drainage system could, you know, discharge is like, would require like, you know, 17,000 cubic feet of material, which is not realistic and not a great, you know, basis for designing. You know, a cubic foot is like a basketball, so like 17,000 basketballs. So that's like way too big. So there are different loading rates, and so like that standard is like not super realistic for Northwest Minnesota. And so I think some of that is like, we're still kind of dialing in what the appropriate loading rate is. But usually, I mean, usually those structures can be, I think, you know, if I back up to the stitch one, I mean, this is kind of like a ditch on the side of the road, and I can't remember off the top of my head what the loading rate was, but it is, again, sort of based on the concentrations you have coming out and what your goals are. But yeah, but for the most part, they are kind of bigger installations.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Anybody? Okay, got Norm here.
Thanks, Lindsay. I'm going to ask you a loaded question.
Yeah.
As you know, they're worried about the algal bloom in Lake Winnipeg, and we've had, shall we say, very experienced or very famous environmentalists causing issues, saying that it's all phosphorus coming off, or phosphate coming off the land. But they did say nothing about the urban centers. Have you seen any comparisons there on your side of the 49th?
Yeah, that is such an important question. And I actually have a totally different presentation where I talk about algal blooms. You know, one of the things that I saw coming from Western Lake Erie Basin is actually this same discussion happening. You know, kind of the in 2014, when the city of Toledo had their water shut off from algae in the drinking water system, you know, the mayor got up on the TV and said, this is the result of mega farms. And, you know, when somebody in that position of power says something like that, even if it's not true, it really kind of takes root in the mind of the public. And so that can be a really delicate situation. And I actually have not seen a lot of, you know, comparisons of phosphorus loading pathways, especially for Lake Winnipeg Basin. I don't think it's necessarily a fair statement to say it's all from farms. I think there's a lot of things happening. And I also think that, you know, I think that it's something that it really has to be looked at. And I think a lot of the goal of my work in Western Lake Erie Basin was to help farmers make their decisions defensible in that kind of context of, you know, broader environmental impact. So like actually my parents were part of the people that got their water shut off when they lost drinking water. So like that gave me a lot of experience explaining to somebody like, well, you know, when my mom says, we'll just ban all fertilizer, and you could have to explain to them, well, that's not realistic and that's not the goal. And and it's about kind of having those like the best of intentions and saying, well, we're doing the best that we can. And, and conservation drainage, I think, can play a really big role in that, and saying like, we're draining when we need to drain to be able to produce food and, produce the food that everyone needs to eat. Right. But then also like we're looking at these other solutions to be able to mitigate any impacts that we are having. That's what we as an agricultural community are doing. And and then you can sort of say, well, do we know what else is happening? But at least from your perspective, you can know that you're doing the best you can. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, I think we have one more question here, and then if anyone does have any further questions for Lindsey, you can definitely submit them to me, and we can do a bit of a follow-up too as well. Okay.
Yeah, this is not much of a question, but it's added to the subject. I've noticed the last few years, there's a lot more algae growing in the water system. And I got a carbon dioxide test for since I bought it. And that would be probably about the last 6 years. We've increased our carbon dioxide by 100 parts per million. And that might be a way of nature's way of using some of that carbon dioxide up and making some oxygen. Because anything green is photosynthesis.
Yeah, and just definitely to kind of add on, I mean, I think reasons why we're seeing more algae, I mean, it's not in the way that biological processes work, right? They're really complex, which I think goes to your point. There's multiple interactions happening. It's not only, it's like, yes, there needs to be a nutrient source, but also they need to have the right conditions to be able to grow. And I think, if we've had, hotter, drier summers, algae really like warm, shallow water. So, if it's hot and it's dry, actually sometimes that can promote algae growth because it's just concentrating all of those nutrients down into the exact environment that they like. So yeah, I definitely think, there can be lots of potential. There's lots of things that are all coming together to make this happen, and this an issue, today, as opposed to, maybe 20 or 30 years ago.
Great, well, thank you very much, Lindsey. I know we learned a lot from that presentation. There's a lot of material in there. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us via Zoom here today. And just the one little statement that stuck to me that I'm going to use from you, if that's okay, is when you need drainage, you need drainage, and that's really is a good statement. I'm going to keep that one. But thank you very much for joining us, and we hope to talk to you again very soon.
Yes, thank you all so much for the invite. Really enjoyed speaking to you all today.